So what I'm going to speak about today are the options for students and scholars and really planning for your future. We can move to the next slide. So just a legal disclaimer, anything I say, it's just informational. If you want any specific advice regarding your own personal situation, please feel free to email me. My contact information will be at the last slide, and I'm more than happy to schedule consultation or answer any of your questions. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about the firm. The firm headquarters is actually in Southern California, but I am personally in the Northern California office in Oakland. We can move to the next slide. One of the coolest things about our firm, which not many other firms have, is we've developed our own software and it's powered by Salesforce. So little pitch there for our software. We can move to the next slide. And then just a little bit about me. I grew up in Fremont, so I'm from the Bay Area. I went to Cal, and then I went up to law school at University of Washington. So I've been practicing immigration law for over 20-something years. And my focus has a lot been with students, startups, high-tech companies, entrepreneurs. So I have a really varied background. We can move to the next slide. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of what we want to talk about. I think everyone, was affected by the 4 years of President Trump's administration, and what's happening now that President Biden has come in, it's undoing a lot of the restrictive measures that were put in towards immigration, and it's moving very slowly, to be honest with you, and I think we can expect it to move slowly. But there have been some strides. I mean, he came into office in January, and now it's May, and so the first thing he did was, he came out with a bunch of executive orders. And what basically he did was try to open the borders rather than close the borders. Because what we found during the 4 years, it was a lot of buy American, hire American, build the wall, do all of that. And then now we're seeing a shift and a change, which is a positive shift and change towards our immigrants. And so what has President Biden done since he came in office? A bunch of executive orders. So one of the great things he threw out the window, which was great, was this whole public charge rule and requiring everyone to submit all their credit reports, their tax returns, and all of that. And then also opening it up and increasing the refugee numbers and things like that. So we can go to the next slide. So one of the things he did was there was a Muslim ban that actually banned immigrants from coming to the United States. So we would have clients who were parents of US citizens who were Iranian and weren't able to immigrate. And so now that door has opened and slowly they're starting to be able to come into the United States. Also the diversity lottery, and I'll talk about that later and what that is. And then really just welcoming immigrants back to the United States. Next slide. So DACA, that was one of the big things that was introduced during the Obama-Biden administration, and that's being revived. So we're going to see a lot of changes happening, and he did introduce a very comprehensive Immigration Reform Act called US Citizenship Act. Whether all of that will be implemented is to be seen, but I feel positive that at least at a minimum DACA will still be there. Some of the things that he introduced, clearing the backlogs, recapturing unused visas, making it easier for people who graduate with a STEM degree, PhD, not being subject to the cap, not being subject to the quotas, increasing diversity visas. Now, these are all just proposed. So it doesn't mean it actually has been implemented, but you can see how the future is looking a little bit brighter for our immigrants. We can move to the next slide. So some of the other things he introduced was creating a pathway to citizenship for undocumented, really prioritizing technology, and a lot of different things. And you can actually go to our site and see a lot of what's happening in immigration today, and just subscribe to our blog. We go to the next slide. So what I really want to talk about today is, what are your options after you graduate, or if you're currently a scholar at UC Davis. So let's talk about some non-immigrant work visas. Non-immigrant means that you're here on a temporary basis. So we can move to the next slide and talk about the H1B. So the H1B is the most common visa type that most people will obtain. And the H1B visa is a professional work visa. So what does that mean? That means that you must have, at a minimum, a bachelor's degree or equivalent. The occupation that you are seeking must normally require a degree, and you must have an employer, okay? So the job has to be one that requires a bachelor's degree. So very typical: software engineer, electrical engineer, accountant. Be employer specific, so you have to have an employer to sponsor you. Part-time or full-time, it doesn't matter. You can work part-time, or you can have a full-time job. You can have more than one H1B employer, so that's what we call concurrent, but it means you have to actually be sponsored by each employer. 6-year maximum, so that means that the maximum time you can be on H1B is 6 years. It's granted typically in 3-year increments. If you decide you're on H1 and you want to change employers, there is flexibility to move and change employers within that 6-year period. And the nice thing that they implemented was that historically, once you were terminated from your position, you had to depart the US immediately. But now there's a 60-day grace period, which is really nice. So we can move to the next slide. So if you have heard a lot of your friends or a lot of your colleagues, there's this buzz about the H1B quota. And typically the buzz is about getting into the H1B quota and being registered. And so every fiscal year, October 1 to September 30th, there are visa numbers that open up for the H1B. Now, this is only for private employers. So if you're going to be working for a university or nonprofit research institution, this really isn't going to apply to you. But it may apply to you if you decide to switch employers and go from a university to a private employer. So the quota is 65,000 per year. And of those, it's broken down 5,400 Singaporean and 1,400 Chilean. The Singaporean and the Chilean quota is never, ever, ever reached. Okay, so if you're Singaporean or Chilean, you pretty much are going to be able to get an H1B1 visa. And then they have an additional 20,000 for those who graduated with a US master's or higher degree. Okay, and how early can you file an H1B? Well, we're filing our H1Bs right now. So April 1st to June 30th is the time period right now that we can file our H's. We can move to the next slide. So what does it look like? What happens? So the government has an online electronic registration portal. And what we do as attorneys is we register our clients into this portal, and there's a $10 fee. And what they do is they hold a lottery. So this year we were supposed to register everyone, I think by March 21st or 22nd. And then they held the lottery, and within a few days, we go online and we can actually see who won the lottery. And how does the lottery work? What they do first is they actually will put everyone into the general pool. So the 65,000 slot pool. And in that, if you are a US master's degree holder or higher and you don't win a number there, there's a special select pool for you. That's the 20,000 pool. And hopefully your chances will increase when you're put in the 20,000 pool. Now, if you think about it, there's 85,000 slots, and this year there were 300,000 registrants. Okay, so if you just kind of do the math and the percentages, it was probably, I think, about 28% or something like that, 30% of people that were selected. Hopefully the folks with the US master's degree were selected more so than those who just had a bachelor's degree. So we were notified, and right now, like I said, we have a 90-day window to file. So we're actually filing the petitions for those who were selected. If you are not selected, they don't outright reject your submission and say you were not picked. They actually will put you on a wait list. So right now we have folks who are on a wait list, and we basically are just waiting to see. Last year, they actually removed a bunch of folks from the wait list, and we had a second filing window, and that was due to COVID. And so this year, what I'm telling most of my clients is it's not looking good to have a second lottery, only because last year what we saw was that many of the folks that were picked, the companies weren't able to file an H1 for them because they were going through layoffs. But this year, what we're seeing is pretty much everyone who was picked is being, a petition's being filed for them. So I doubt that registration will reopen and they'll take people off the wait list. So we can move to the next slide. So what's your timeline? It's never too early to think about H1B sponsorship, never too early, right? And if you're going through the interview process right now, it's always important to be candid and honest. So when they ask that question, will you now or ever in the future require sponsorship to work? You should say yes, okay? And you'll be surprised, there are lots of employers that are willing to sponsor H1Bs, and there are lots of employers who don't even know what an H1B is, but they're willing to listen and they're willing to, you know, learn about the process. And so typically our clients, actually we find out usually by the fall. So by October, November, December, we're asking our employers, who do you want to sponsor for an H1? Who's on an OPT? And we go through the process of starting to collect all the information and the data. And then in March, we register the foreign nationals. In order to register, we need your passport, we need your information, your biographic data, all of that. But we also take it one step further, and we like to assess the case and make sure you'll actually, if you are selected, your case will actually be approved. And like I said, now the window is open, so we're filing our cases until June 30th. And then on October 1, that's when the H1B actually goes into effect. Okay, so 10/1/2021, you're allowed to apply 6 months early, so that's why they allow you to apply April 1st. And there is premium processing. So regular processing is typically about 4 to 6 months, but if you want, you could pay the government an extra $2,500, and they will allow you to premium process it in 15 calendar days. And it is available right now. Sometimes when they get flooded with applications, they'll remove it temporarily. But right now, premium processing is available. We can go to the next slide. So this is just kind of a trajectory to see, you know, when should you be thinking about all of this? Well, if you graduated last year, you should have already thought about it, and you should have already been in the lottery, right? But let's say you're graduating next year, and you know that you're going to have OPT for a year. Or you know you actually can get STEM OPT for another 2 years, right? So a total of 3 years to be able to apply for the H1B. So when you just look at this timeline, what's most important to look at? You know, the most important thing is try to go into the lottery as many times as you can. Typically, our clients can go in for at least 3 times, right? And then if you are at the period where your STEM OPT expires, like July of 20, so our clients whose STEM OPT expires in July of 2021, if they were picked, they can actually keep working until their H1B kicks in on October 1 of 2021. Okay, that's what we call the gap cap period. So it's really important that when you plan for the future, you really look at how many times can I be put into the H1B lottery. And if you're not born in China or India, which has really impacted green card processing delays, think about whether you can actually obtain a green card within that 3-year period as well. Okay. And what do you do if you don't get picked and you're your STEM OPT is expired or your OPT is expired. Well, there's many options to look at. Many of our students will actually re-enroll in school. Some of their employers will actually send them overseas and work for the overseas company. So there's a variety of things that we look at in terms of options if you're not selected. Next slide. So what does the H1B process entail besides filing? There is a wage component to it. So the employer has to attest that they're willing to pay the actual wage or the prevailing wage, whichever is higher. So I always give the example, let's say you're applying for, you're being sponsored for an H1B as a software engineer, and the prevailing wage is $100,000. So that's what the Department of Labor says is the prevailing wage. And you can look at the data center here that we give you as a link. But let's say all your colleagues are being paid $120,000. Your salary must be the higher of the actual wage or the prevailing wage. So the company must offer you at least $120,000. And what the employer has to do is they have to attest they're going to be paying the prevailing wage or the actual wage, whichever is higher. And they have to do a bunch of notices or postings to let the affected workers know that they're sponsoring someone for an H1. It doesn't list your, your name or anything like that, just list the occupation and then the salary or the salary ranges. And then we will submit the LCA with the Department of Labor, and it takes them 7 calendar days to process. We go to the next slide. So what are some of the obligations of the employer, right? I get a lot of questions like, can I pay for the legal fees and the filing fees? Because my employer doesn't really understand the H1B process and they don't want to pay the fees. The filing fees and the filing fees alone are typically around like $3,000 just for regular processing. And then the premium processing is $2,500. And then the legal fee is just dependent upon, the firm that's helping your employer. But the rule is that your employer must pay for all the legal and filing fees. And the reason being that if you pay for it, your salary actually goes below the actual wage or the prevailing wage. The only thing that you are allowed to pay is the $2,500 premium processing fee, especially if it's for your benefit. And again, the employer must pay your wage. They can't bench you, which means that if there's no work for you, that they can't just put you on a leave of absence and tell you, sorry, we can't pay you. But if you need to go off on leave for family leave, that's completely fine. If they terminate you before your H1B ends, they do have to offer you reasonable transportation back home. And they also will notify the Immigration Service and withdraw your petition. Okay, whether you have to take the return transportation home is up to you. They can't force you to leave. But it is something by law they must offer you. We can go to the next slide. So how does the Immigration Service verify that you're actually working for the H1B employer? Well, they actually do fraud investigations. And even during COVID time, they were still doing them. They actually would tell individuals to meet them at the parking lot of the company, right? And what do? They basically will come. They will ask to see your identification. They will ask to see your pay stubs, information about the job you're doing, making sure that everything that the employer has listed on the petition is actually what you're doing and what you're being compensated for. And so they'll look at your pay stubs and your W-2s. And these site visits are not scary. Okay, it's very simple. They usually last no more than 15 to 20 minutes. When offices were open pre-COVID, they actually would tour the offices and they would take pictures. So if you are selected for an H1B audit, it's nothing to be afraid of. Just answer the questions and answer them truthfully. We can go to the next slide. So are H1Bs getting harder? They were a lot harder during the President Trump administration. Are they going to be just as hard in President Biden's administration? I think they are not going to be in terms of harder. They're just going to be really following the rules, right? So Ali Mayorkas, who heads up the Department of Homeland Security, was a former lawyer, and he really goes by the rules, right? And so what will we see? Well, we're still seeing requests for evidence, okay, but they're not as quote unquote nasty as they used to be. I think they're a little bit more reasonable, but we're still getting them, right? And what you have to think about is the officers that were trained under President Trump's administration are still working, at the different service centers. So any change in policy from the top or any change in the way that they view petitions is not going to trickle down for a while. And so we still are seeing some of those crazy RFEs, but many times, as long as we answer them and we provide the evidence, even though it's really cumbersome, the cases are approved. And so what are we seeing most common? Do you need a degree to do the job? Prove to us that the position is a specialty occupation and requires a specific degree to do the job. We used to get them all the time for software engineers. Now it's getting less and less, but we still do see them. If you are an entry-level position, is it really appropriate for you to be classified under the level 1 wage with the Department of Labor? Almost 1/3 of all petitions receive RFE. We were seeing that before. I don't know necessarily we're seeing that now, because I noticed that our RFE rates are lower, but we still are getting RFEs. And again, the degree has to be linked to the occupation. So if you have a philosophy degree and you're being hired as a software engineer, really have to link that and explain how is that related, because the government's really black and white. There's no gray, right? So they really have to see how is your degree related to that job. We can go to the next slide. So if the H-1B cap has been met, what can I do? What are my options? So if you're working for a cap exempt organization, so institutions of higher education, universities and colleges, nonprofit affiliated with the institution of higher education, there's many hospitals that usually fall within that, nonprofit research organization or government research organization. So that means that try and get a job with one of the universities or an organization that fits within these exceptions, right? Because these organizations are not subject to the numerical cap. They can file an H-1B at any time, right? And so that's the nice thing if you can secure a job, right, for those organizations. If you can, and then you decide you actually want to work for a private employer, unfortunately, you are going to be subject to the cap. So what does that mean? That means if you got an H-1B to work for UC Davis, you were not counted against the cap. So when you want to go work for ABC company and they want to sponsor you, they will have to put you through the registration and you will have to win the number before they can actually employ you. Now, one of the workarounds that many of our clients do is they will continue their job with, let's say, UC Davis, and then they will take a part-time job with the private employer and be able to still work for the private employer under what we call concurrent employment, but they still need to keep their employment with their university. So we can move to the next slide. So a lot of my clients will ask me, well, I have this great idea and I'm getting funding and I want to start my own business, right? I want to start my own business. Can I be sponsored for an H-1B? You can, but there are limitations. Some of the limitations are the company can't be owned majority by you, okay? And why is that? Because the government finds it really hard to find an employer-employee relationship if you won't be firing yourself, right? And so they need to see an organization and a board or folks that can actually vote you out, right? So let's say there's a board of 3, 2 can vote you out, then they think that is an employer-employee relationship. You also have to be a W-2 employee. So many of our clients will say, well, I'm going to be the CEO. And then I will say, okay, well, the salary you have to be paid is $250,000. Now, if you're in the startup world, that's not possible. And so we really have to look at what is the essential function of your role. You can call yourself anything fancy, but what are you actually doing? And if at the end of the day, you're a software engineer, then really you're a software engineer and you should be paid the software engineer prevailing wage. We can go to the next slide. So what are the other issues for startup businesses? Again, just proving that they have the funding, right? And I have done H1Bs for the first employee of a startup company and I can get them approved and it's no problem, right? It just really depends upon the documentation and what you can show to prove the viability of the company. And that you're actually going to be doing real work. Like maybe there are contracts or there's R&D or something that you're doing that the government can understand the need to have you for 3 years. Place of business, office, that used to be before the government wanted to see brick and mortar, they wanted to see a physical place. I think now because of COVID, a lot of that's going to be relaxed because a lot of our clients are actually going 100% remote and they actually don't have physical spaces anymore and people are actually working from home. Next slide. So what are the top 10 myths about the H1B visa? So again, small company or startup can't qualify for an H1B. Of course, I already told you, they can. You have to advertise to show there's no qualified US workers. That's not true. There is no advertising requirement. The only requirement is that the position you're being offered requires a degree and you have a relevant degree and they're going to pay you the offered wage or the prevailing wage. You must depart the US immediately upon termination or resignation. No, you have 60 days to actually remain in the US and find a new employer. You get a new 6-year period if you change from H1B to another status. Like let's say you go from F1 to H1B, then you go back to H1B. No, you only get a 6-year window. That's it. The only time you get another 6-year window or period is if you leave for a year. So you go outside of the country for a year, then you have to put yourself back into the H1B lottery. Must be a full-time position? No, it can actually be a part-time position. It can even be a concurrent position. Must have a master's degree at time of H1B registration. So when we register you for the H1B lottery, you have to have earned your master's degree at the time of filing. So if I'm going to file your case in May, then you have to have your degree in May. So I can still register you in March as long as it's understood that you will have your master's degree in May. If you don't have your master's degree in May and I register you and you win the master's number, then unfortunately I cannot submit your application because you don't have a master's degree. Premium processing increases the chances of approval. Completely false. Okay, even if you pay the $2,500, it doesn't mean anything, then your case is going to be processed in 15 calendar days. That's pretty much the guarantee. That's it. It doesn't guarantee an approval. An amended H1B does not need to be filed before you change worksite locations in another state. That's completely false. Okay, you must always file and notify the Immigration Service if you're changing worksite locations and it's outside of the normal commuting distance. So let's say you work in Sacramento, but now you're going to work all the way down in Los Angeles physically. You have to file an amended H1 before you actually move. You must have a US degree to qualify. Also false. You can have a foreign degree as long as it's equivalent to a US degree. You have to work for a certain time period on H1B before green card sponsorship. Also false. Your employer can sponsor you even before you get an H1 or even while you're on F1 status, which a lot of my clients are really surprised. You just have to be really careful about your travel during that time period. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So want to talk about other visa types. I'm not going to spend too much time on these visas. But like I mentioned before, there's the H1B one for citizens of Chile and Singapore. And these visas are good for 18 months, also requires a degree to do the job and a professional position. You can apply at the consulates, so in Chile and Singapore if they're open, or you can file a change of status with the Immigration Service if you're currently here in the US. TN is the NAFTA visa for Canadians and Mexicans, very narrow, specific occupations that qualify under this TN visa category. So for example, an engineer, an accountant, Canadians can apply at the border, but you have to be careful applying at the border right now because there are restrictions of essential travel for people that are crossing the border. If you fly, that's a different story. You can submit your application if you're flying to a Canadian airport. And then Mexicans must apply for a visa to US consulate in Mexico. So you actually have to be interviewed by a consular officer. And then there's a special visa E3 for Australian professionals or citizens. We can move to the next slide. This is the intercompany transferee. This is the L1 visa. And so this is a visa for, let's say, before you came to the US, you were working for a large company overseas for at least a year, and you were an engineer or you were a manager, and then you came here for a 1-year program, right? Or maybe your MBA, a 2-year program, and then that same company wants to now sponsor you for an L1 to work for their US subsidiary branch or affiliate. That's what we call an L1 visa. And those are people who worked for an entity abroad and then want to come to the US and work for this a related entity here. We can go to the next slide. So what are the requirements to be able to do this? You don't have to be a national of the same country. So if you came from the UK, it doesn't matter if the company is a US company or owned by other individuals. So anyone can qualify as long as you have worked for that company overseas for at least a year, physically for a year. There's no quota. You can qualify at any time and apply at any time. If it's a startup and it's a brand new business that's being created in the US, you get a 1-year period. And then you can renew it in 3-year increments. If it's an established company, then it's 3 years. So there are 2 categories, L1 for a manager executive, or L1B, which is a specialized knowledge. And the manager gets 7 years and the L1B gets 5 years. So we go to the next slide. So this is the E1, E2 visa, and these are visas for countries that have a treaty specifically with the US. And you can look at the link here and it'll tell you what are some of the treaty countries. And so, for example, Italy has a treaty with the US. And so if you're an Italian citizen and you want to open a company in the US, or you're working for a company that's at least 50% Italian owned here in the US, then you can come in on an E1 or an E2 visa. E1 is for trading. So let's say they have an import-export and they import or export just like olive oil, then you would come in on an E1. And E2 are individuals or companies that have invested a substantial amount of capital into the US. Substantial in the terms of what they're creating, right? So we've done successful E2s for people that have invested $150,000 or $200,000 in a new startup. So this is a very good visa type for some of our students who are a member of a treaty country and want to start up their own business and have startup capital that's coming from the treaty country. We go to the next slide. So what are the requirements? E1, treaty trader, 50% of the trade has to be with the treaty country in the US. So just my example of the olive oil and Italy and the US trading, and majority of the trade is between the US and Italy. E2 investor, substantial investment, and you have to be coming in either as an investor, an employee, and if you're coming in as an investor, you have to come in and develop and direct the enterprise. Dependents can come to the US. Dependents are defined as children under the age of 21, and spouses can actually get a work permit, which is unrestricted, but it takes time to get the work permit. It takes about 6 months to get the work permit once they come here. Next slide. Oh, so this is the most popular O1 visa. Many of our scholars will come to us and say, hey, do I qualify for an O1 visa? And the O1 visa is what we call the extraordinary ability visa. And what the government's really looking at is, are you at the top of your field? And do you meet certain criteria? Have you been published? Have you judged the work of others? Have you won any awards? Are you being paid a high remuneration? So a variety of factors that we look at and the government looks out to see if you actually meet this criteria. And this is the most common visa type that many of our clients will ask us if they qualify under, if they can't get the H1. And it doesn't mean if you have a PhD, you automatically qualify for an O1 visa. We really have to look at your accomplishments to let you know whether you qualify for an O1 visa, which also means that you don't have to have a PhD to qualify for an O1 visa. So even if you have a bachelor's degree, and even those who've never even completed their education can qualify for an O1 visa. Let me go to the next slide. So I talked a lot about non-immigrant visas, and those are temporary visas. And so I see there's a lot of questions about how do I actually get a permanent visa, or what we call an immigrant visa or a green card, right? So green cards is a permanent ability to live and work in the United States. So we can go to the next slide. So what are some of the green card options? So I talked earlier about the diversity lottery, and that's basically a green card lottery. So you put your name in a hat and then they pick your name and you win a green card. And so my one piece of advice for you is, if your country is eligible under the diversity lottery program, you should apply. Why? It's free, and it only comes around once a year. And I was having dinner with someone and I asked, my question is always, how did you come to the US? And he told me that he won the green card lottery. And, you know, it does happen. And so what you should do is go to the Department of State website, only go to this site, don't go to any other site. There are a lot of fraudulent sites that actually will ask you to pay them money. So don't enter it, and then make sure it is this site, because there are also sites that take your personal information and don't ask for money. So number one rule, only go to this travel.state.gov site, and then look at the countries that qualify, right? So countries that have a high migration rate to the US. So like, I'm Filipino, so a lot of people from the Philippines come to the US. Unfortunately, the Philippines can't qualify under the diversity lottery program. The goal behind this program really is to increase the number of people that immigrate to the US from countries that normally don't immigrate to the US, right? So many of the countries in Africa are part of the diversity lottery program. So of course, Canada, UK, India, Mexico, Philippines, not part of the program. And it is based on your country of birth or your spouse's country of birth. We can go to the next slide. So I know we have probably a bunch of folks who are on the J1 as an academic or scholars. And the number one thing you need to look at if you want to get a green card is, are you subject to the 2-year home residency requirement? And if you are, those are going to be barriers to you getting an H1B or a green card. And if you are subject because you're on what we call the skills list, okay, so you're learning a skill in the US that your home country wants you to bring back, that's what we call the skills list. You can get that waived, and we've gotten waived for many of our clients, but you have to deal with your home government. So for example, we have clients from India, and they actually are able to get their 2-year waiver requirement waived, but it takes a long time. It takes like about 3 years. But if you're from China, before we used to get it waived, it's 6 months. Now, if you are subject because you're a Fulbright, you receive public government funding from your home government or the US government, a lot harder to get it waived, especially for Fulbrights, very difficult. And these are some of the ways that you can get it waived. You get an interested government agency supporting your waiver. You will be subjected to persecution if you return to your home country. There will be exceptional hardship if you're married to a US citizen or a permanent resident, or if you have children, if you return to your home country, or there's a request from the state public health department. And this only applies to foreign medical graduates. So if you're subject to the 2-year home residency requirement, important to seek legal counsel and find out if there are ways to waive it. Otherwise, you will need to go home for 2 years. Next slide. This is what we call the visa bulletin. And this visa bulletin tells us when you can actually obtain your green card. Okay. And so I'm going to go through the different categories in the latter slides. But what does this chart tell you? It basically tells you that if you're born in India and you are someone of extraordinary ability, right? How long will it take you to get your green card? Or if you are a person, you know, and you are from China and you have a master's degree, and as of May 1, 2021, they're processing December 1, 2016. So if you just do the math, probably a 5-year wait. So how do you know what date to look at? You either have to look at the date your PERM was filed or your I-140 or I-130 petition was filed. I know these are a bunch of acronyms and numbers, but I'll explain that later. We can go to the next slide. So these are family-based green cards. We can go to the next slide. So these are green cards that are being sponsored by a relative, right? So if you are the child or spouse or parent of a US citizen, you can be immediately sponsored for a green card. Immediately sponsored means that they can file it, but whether you'll get the green card right away is a different story. Usually if you're in the US, it's about a 12 to 18 month processing time. And if you're overseas, it's probably about the same or longer just because of COVID. The nice thing is that when you apply and you're physically here, you do get a work permit and travel permit, usually issued within 6 months. That's good for a year. If you're married to a US citizen, your green card is only good for 2 years. So you actually have to go back to the government and prove that the marriage was bona fide, or if the marriage has ended, that the marriage was bona fide when you married. Adult children must be 21 years old to sponsor. So many of my clients will say, I just had a baby here in the US, it's a US citizen. And I said, great, they'll give you some benefit when they're 21 years old. So they really can't give you any green card benefit until they're 21 years old. We go to the next slide. So what are the family-based categories? So the chart before showed you the different categories. So there's unmarried adult children of US citizens. We call that the first preference. Spouses of permanent residents or minor children, that's the second preference category A. And then unmarried adult children of green card holders, that's the second category preference B. And then married adult children of US citizens, that's the third preference. And then lastly, the fourth preference, brothers and sisters of US citizens. Now my family's Filipino. My dad came here as an electrical engineer for Boeing. So he was sponsored as an employment-based. And my mom had 6 brothers and sisters. And so she sponsored her parents, who then in return sponsored their children. And then my mom also sponsored her US citizen, her brothers and sisters. So this basically was the whole chain of immigration for my family. So children must be under the age of 21 at the time they get the green card. So that's the magic number for immigration is 21. We go to the next slide. So employment-based green cards, right? And these are green cards that you get based on an offer of employment or your skills or your education, okay? And this is the highest category in terms of green card sponsorship. So what does that mean? That means typically it's the fastest way to get a green card. So when you're talking to your friends and they're bragging that they're EB1, it probably means that they're going to get their green card faster than you. But let's just kind of go through the subcategories. EB1A, anyone can apply. You can self-sponsor, meaning you don't have to have an employer, but it's a very, very high standard. So you have to meet certain criteria. And even if you meet the criteria, the government will still look at the entire package as a whole. And if they find you don't meet their high standard, they could still deny the application. So this EB1A is a very, very high standard and very difficult to get. We have seen people with amazing credentials who have been denied the EB1A, but still possible, but just hard. Outstanding researchers and professors, what we call the EB1B. So these are for folks who are being sponsored. You must have an employer sponsor you, whether it be a university or a private employer. And you have to be able to prove that you have 3 years of research, or if you obtained your research during your education, that it was outstanding. And then you also have to meet the other criteria similar to the EB1A. You've been published, judged the work of others. You know, the whole criteria is on the immigration site or on our website. And then multinational managers and executives are people who are like the L1, they've worked overseas for at least a year, and then they're being transferred to work for a related company in the US as a manager or an executive. Go to the next slide. The second preference and the third preference categories. So these are folks who at a minimum have a master's degree or a bachelor's and 5 years of work experience for EB2. And then EB3 is everyone else. So if you have a bachelor's degree, you would qualify under EB3. So the other, the most common green card type besides the EB2, EB3, under the EB2 is what we call the national interest waiver, which I'll go through in another slide. So you'll hear a lot of your colleagues and friends also saying, are you sponsored under EB2? Are you sponsored under EB3? And then some people like to hop around between EB2 and EB3. We can go to the next slide. So I was talking about the national interest waiver. So a lot of my clients who can't meet the EB1 standard, we actually look and see, is the work you're doing in the national interest of the United States? And if your employer were to advertise for the job, would they even be able to find anyone like you? And the answer has to be no, because the work you're doing is very unique and it would not be beneficial for them to advertise because they can't find anybody. And so this is just the criteria that they look at for a national interest waiver. The national interest waiver is a great category for those who are not born in China or India. If you're born in China or India, you will still have a long wait time. Remember, I told you about 6 years for those from China. So for our clients who are F1 students, many times if they qualify for a national interest waiver and they're not born in China or India, we recommend they just go for it because it's a self-sponsored visa. You don't need an employer to sponsor you, but you do have a high standard to meet to be able to show that you have substantial intrinsic merit and the work you're doing is of national importance. So, you know, here's some of the criteria here that you can look at. We can move to the next slide. Request for evidence, RFE. So it is common for the Immigration Service to issue RFEs for the EB1 category or the national interest waiver. And RFEs is basically the government coming back after reviewing your petition or not reviewing your petition and asking additional questions. And so the number one thing when you get an RFE is really read what they're asking. And many times they will be asking you the same things that you have already provided. But what you really need to do is ask yourself, did I really give the evidence that they're looking for? Is there any other backup evidence that I can give that can really show how I meet the criteria? And so many times my clients get offended that they were issued an RFE because they are accomplished, but it doesn't matter. The government doesn't really look at all the evidence in the way that you think they look at evidence. So you really have to explain it to them why you are, you know, extraordinary. So we can go to the next slide. So the most common way that employers will actually sponsor individuals for a green card is what we call the PERM process. And this is a process where the employer actually has to test the labor market So they'll actually put ads in the newspaper, they'll post it online, they'll post it with the Employment Development Department, and they have to test the market and prove they can't find a US worker. Once they are successful under this test and the Department of Labor certifies the application, then the second and third steps is actually going to the Immigration Service and applying for the green card. So step 2 is the immigrant visa petition. That's where you provide all your education, your experience letters, and that's where your employer proves that they can actually pay your salary. And then the last step is what we call the green card application. And that's where you can actually apply for your work permit and your travel permit. And then any of your dependents under 21 and your spouse can also apply. Everyone used to be interviewed under the Trump administration, but they've been waiving that now, especially due to COVID. So if you go through this process and you're not born in China or India, you could pretty much get through this process, I would say, in about 2 years, barring any delays or audits. If you're born in China or India and you go through this process, it typically takes between 6 to 10 years. So there is quite a long waiting period. You can go to the next slide. So what are some of the issues when you're doing your PERM with your employer? The number one rule is you can't decide whether you're EB2 or EB3. Your employer decides that because it's not based on what you have, but what the occupation requires. So if the occupation only requires a bachelor's degree and all your colleagues have a bachelor's degree, your employer can't require a master's degree just because you have it. That's what's called tailoring. It has to be the lowest common denominator. What is the minimum requirement needed for this position? Everyone wants to always throw in a language requirement. Well, it's not going to help you because unless your job is a translator, throwing in any language requirements only makes it suspect and harder for it to get approved. You can't usually use the experience you gained at the company that's sponsoring you because then the argument would be they could train anybody because they trained you. And when do you start the green card process? I see a lot of questions. You could start the green card process anytime. Like I said, you could start it when you're in your F1, you could start when you're a TN, you could start it at any time. You could even start it when you're not even here in the US if you find an employer who's willing to sponsor you. But if you're on H1, you should start it no later than your 4th year in H1B because it does take time to get through the process and you want to be able to make sure that you can continue to stay here while you're waiting for the green card to come through. Then of course, you should make sure you want to stay with your employer long-term, right? Because it is a process and it will take some time. You can go to the next slide. So this is the final and last stage. So once you get your green card, whether it be through family or employment or the diversity lottery, you can apply for citizenship. And President Biden is actually trying to push these applications through and has made it a priority. And if you got your green card through employment or family, you can apply once you've been a green card holder for 4 years and 9 months. So it's a 5-year threshold, but you can apply a little bit early. If you're married to a US citizen, then 3 years. You've had your green card for 3 years, but they'll let you apply 3 months early. So 2 years and 9 months. The rule is you have to be physically present in the US for at least half of that time. So if you have to be a green card holder for 5 years, 2.5 of those years, you have to be physically in the US. You can't be out of the country for more than 6 months. So we have a lot of clients that are stuck overseas who have green cards. And so they've actually been out of the country for over a year. And so it's a lot harder to meet all these requirements. A lot of my clients will ask me, well, Charina, can I keep my Canadian citizenship and my US citizenship? I said, it depends. If Canada allows for dual citizenship, then we will allow it too. So it really varies by country. You know, the next slide. So a lot of questions that my clients and students have been asking me is, can I travel, Charina? I really want to go home for the summer. I haven't seen my family in 18 months. Can I travel? My number one advice to you is do not travel, right? Because everything still is in flux right now with COVID. And most recently, we saw it with the India travel bans. And so you never know what's going to happen and whether you're going to be restricted from coming back into the US. If you have a US citizen spouse or child, then you can travel, okay? Because those folks are usually exempt because they have a US citizen spouse or child. But if you do not, then you have to be really, really careful about where you travel and when you travel. So many of my clients will say, Charina, I have a visa. Can I travel? My question I will ask you is, when does your visa expire? Where are you going? How long will you be gone? Because we have to look at a variety of factors to decide whether it's actually going to be safe for you to actually leave the country and whether it'll be safe for you to come back. Because the last thing you want is that you leave thinking you're only going to be gone for 2 weeks, and then you're stuck for 6 months and you can't return to your work or you can't return to your academic program, okay? And just remember that a lot of the consulates are still closed, okay? Not many countries have resumed normal business. And so you'll find that even if you want to get a visa stamp, you can't, because the consulate is closed and they only will accept expedited appointments. Or they'll book you an appointment for June and then they'll cancel it and move it to September. So you have to understand that the minute you leave this country, it's going to be difficult to come back in. Now, my students who have a valid visa, and let's say they're going to Italy, and they can actually come back to the US as long as your visa is valid. You don't have to worry, right? But if you're going to India, then that's a different story. Okay, there are more restrictions if you're going to certain countries, India, China, I think Brazil and Iran. We can go back to the next slide or go to the next slide. So if you're an F1, J1, M1 visa, it's really important that you look at what are the travel bans. Are you really free to travel? I'm sure you can contact your ISS office and ask them, right? Because I'm sure they'll be able to tell you about the current travel bans. But it's really important that you look at the Department of State websites and see whether you're going to be able to come back in. If you're going to the UK, Ireland, Schengen area, there are certain restrictions, but if you're an F1 or M1, you can come back in. You don't have to worry about that as long as you have a valid visa. It's harder though if you're going to Brazil, Iran, India, or China, because they will require a national interest exception for you to come to the United States. So you really have to look at that. And now they have another rule that your program has to start after August 1st of 2021, and you have to enter within 30 days of your start date. So really read those rules carefully and talk to ISS to make sure that you actually can come back. And then how can you qualify for a national interest exception? It's a very high standard. They're really looking at why you're coming to the US and what benefits you're going to provide to the US. And usually they look at the critical infrastructure. So what are you going to be doing? Are you in the healthcare field? And usually our healthcare workers can actually come back to the US. We can go to the next slide. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation, and I was asked to answer some of these commonly asked questions. And I know we have a lot of questions too. But how do I find an employer who will sponsor? So the best way to find an employer who will sponsor is to, you can look at this site called H1B Visa Jobs. I think that's what the site's called. And they actually will tell you which employers have sponsored for an H, because that information is actually public information. You can go on the Department of Labor website and look. But many times I tell my clients, you probably should go to your career center and just talk to your advisors there. And I'm sure they'll be able to tell you which of the students they know have been able to get sponsored for an H1B. You can also ask your colleagues and your friends, and that's probably the best way to find a sponsor. I'm sorry, but I don't provide sponsors. A lot of clients will come to me and they'll say, Charina, find me a sponsor. I don't find employers to sponsor you. All I can do is help you once you find an employer who's willing to sponsor you. who typically pays for the fees. There are certain visas that require the employer to pay for all. So like the H1B, the employer is required to pay for all. If you go through the PERM process, the employer is required to pay for the PERM process. But all the other visa types and categories, it's up to the employer. And they all have their own policies, right, of what they will pay and what they won't pay. Just to give you an idea, many of my clients are like mid-sized companies. Maybe they have like 500 employees, 200 employees, 1,000 employees or more. And many times they have a policy that they will actually pay for everything. They'll also pay for the dependents. Some of my clients, they don't pay for dependents, right? But they will pay for your costs. Some of my clients that are smaller may say, no, you know, we're going to split it. So, but of course, for the H1 and the PERM, they'll pay for everything. So each employer has a different policy. So you have to ask what's their policy and who needs to pay. Is there a difference in being sponsored by a private company, government agency, national lab, or university? Yes, there is. So when we were talking about the H1B and whether you're going to be subject to those numerical quotas, like I said, if it's a nonprofit, university, research organization, you don't have to worry about quotas, which means you don't have to worry about the cap. You don't have to worry about the lottery, right? But if you're working for a private company, then yes, you need to worry about that. Also, some universities don't actually sponsor for the green card, right? So they may not sponsor you for a PERM. They may not sponsor you for, you know, an EB1 or a national interest waiver, anything like that. So you really need to look at what is the policy of the organization and what's their green card and visa sponsorship policy. What are the options if the window to secure a job is missed while on OPT or STEM OPT? I talked about that before. So if you're unable to secure a job, it's really important that you talk to ISS about how long you can actually be unemployed. We had a number of clients who actually, because they were so desperate, they actually paid for fake employment. And it's in the papers and you could see the organization that it was. And now those folks are being targeted and they're actually probably at some point all going to be removed from the United States because their identities have been revealed. So it's important that you secure legitimate employment when you're on OPT or STEM OPT and don't get desperate and pay to get employment. You know, talk to the ISS office to find out what sort of what activities you can do on your OPT or STEM OPT and still be within the requirements and regulations. Now, if you miss the window, unfortunately, you're going to go into your grace period and then you'll either have to change to another status or depart the US. What are the J1 limitations? There's a lot of limitations, so it just depends on the category. But the number one limitation I would say is if you're subject to the 2-year home residency requirement. If you are, then it's really difficult for you to switch to an H1, even switch to an O1, because you'll probably have to leave the country to get your O1 and also get a green card. So really look at the limitations for the J1 when you're looking at that program type. What are the challenges of moving from an academic to a non-academic role? I think it's pretty similar to those who are on H1 and are cap exempt, and then they want to go work for a private employer. Really looking at that and seeing whether you will be able to secure an H1B visa number, right? Because like I said, there's a H1B lottery that you have to go through and the registration period is every March. We can go to the next slide. I think that's it. We're just going to move to questions. So I see there are a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask Nate if he can help me out and let me know what some of the questions that came on the floor.
In terms of linkage between the degree and occupation for H1B, does my final degree need to match the occupation, or is it enough if one of the bachelor's degrees fits the industry?
It's enough if one of your bachelor's degrees meets the industry. So many times we'll have students that have pursued a PhD or master's, but unfortunately their degrees actually aren't related to the H1B job. So what we do is we'll actually, if they're foreign degree, let's say their foreign degree was in computer science, then we'll actually get an evaluation done by a accredited evaluator, and they will actually obtain an evaluation that says their degree is equivalent to a US degree. So yeah, as long as you have a related degree, whether it be a bachelor's or master's, PhD or whatever, we can work with it. And even if you don't have a related degree, if you have related experience, then we could probably get an equivalent as well too.
Okay, great. Is there an allocated lottery award for USA PhD recipients?
I don't think so, no. I mean, everyone has the same lottery numbers. It's 65,000 general, and then 20,000 for US master's degree holder or higher. Is that something else, Nate, that I'm not answering?
I think, yeah, I think that's what they're getting at. There's priority if you've got a US master's degree, but there's no separate priority if you've got a US PhD.
Yeah, just there's not. You're still the same. You're in the same pool.
Could you give an example of achievements of people who can apply for H1B visas, especially in STEM field and publications?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, you really have to look at what they look at is your, your Google citation, your publications, how were they published in a well-known publication? Have you won awards? Awards you won in college, unfortunately, they don't count, right? So really looking at national and international awards. Also looking at whether you've made an original contribution to the industry, you've worked in a critical or essential capacity for an organization. We have so many different clients that are doing amazing things. We have a bunch of O1s that we've done for a company that's just, in physics or different types of fields, like a cutting edge field. And so we really look at that to see. So my advice to you is, if you want to see if you're qualified under the O1, typically when UC Davis students will email me, I will send them a questionnaire and an assessment sheet, and then we look at it, and then we'll tell you, oh no, sorry, you're still a little bit junior in your career. You probably need to do more reviews, more X, Y, and Z. Come back to us, in a 6 months or a year.
Great. Does applying for the diversity green card lottery hurt my chances to apply for other types of visas?
No, I think a lot of people are concerned because when they apply for a visa overseas, you just want to disclose anything that's related to a green card that you've applied for, right? When you go to the US consulate for an interview. And it doesn't, if you tell them, I want to renew my student visa, and yes, I applied and submitted my name for the diversity lottery, that's not necessarily negative, because your chances of winning the diversity lottery is probably similar to your chances to winning the California lottery, right? So, I think you just have to be candid and honest when you submit your application for the diversity lottery, and just let the consular officers know that you actually did submit a lottery application and you were not picked. But your intention is to go back home after you finish your F1 studies or your J1 research.
Okay, great. What are my best options if I'm on a J1 visa as a postdoc with a French passport and I'm not subject to the 2-year rule?
What are your best options? I think you have to look at my slides and look and see if you can get an H1B, if you can qualify for an O1, if you can go straight to green card sponsorship and self-sponsor as a national interest waiver. There's just so many different options. And unfortunately, unless I see your resume or your CV, I can't really provide an assessment of people's options.
Great. Does the green card depend on the country of birth or the passport on which the F1 visa is stamped?
It's the country of birth because you can't change your country of birth. So everything with the Immigration Service in terms of visa quotas, green card quotas, diversity lottery is based on your country of birth.
Okay. How long can I remain in the US to look for a job after graduating?
So there is a grace period and it's typically 60 days. So just check with your ISS office and make sure that you're complying within your grace period.
Here's one, perhaps does not have enough context here, but do co-authorships count for publications or do they have to be first authored papers? I imagine that's referring to O1.
Yeah, it's probably referring to O1 or NIW or EB1. It depends, we don't dismiss the fact that you are a third author or a second author, but we look at all the evidence as a whole. So what I always recommend to my clients is don't be humble, just send us everything and let us decide what really makes a strong application for you.
Okay, here's one about a particular situation, but perhaps you can discuss more broadly. So if we have an ongoing DS 2019, can we get an expedited appointment at the US Embassy in our home country to renew our visa?
Depends on the home country, and then also depends on the reason for the expedite, okay? Like I said, many of our expedited appointments are being approved for those coming in the research and healthcare field, right? But many of ours that we see, if they're coming in for business reasons or anything like that, it's a little bit more difficult to get approved. Nate, do you have any that were approved recently you can share with them?
For expedited appointments?
Yeah.
Yeah, so obtaining an expedited appointment, they're looking for real emergencies, and it does depend on where. I think some places it may be easier than others. So it may help if you're employed and you can show if you're not in the US immediately, there's going to be a traumatic financial loss to the company. Humanitarian emergencies, needing to be in the US to care for someone who's sick or to address your own urgent medical needs or something like that. But it is very up in the air.
Yeah, I think it's just really important that you follow the instructions of the website, and it will give you details as to what they're looking for to qualify for an expedited appointment. So really look at it and see.
Okay, if I get an H1B through a cap exempt organization, can my spouse work for a private employer?
Your spouse is completely independent from you, right? So the only reason your spouse is affected is if you are subject to a 2-year home residency requirement, then your spouse is automatically subject as well. But if that's not the case, your spouse is independent and can secure their own independent work authorization. So it doesn't matter if you work for an H1B cap subject employer, your spouse can work for anyone as long as they qualify and are sponsored.
When am I eligible to apply for a green card? Currently, I am on my F1 visa.
Anyone can apply for a green card at any time, meaning like, let's say you're family sponsored, you could be sponsored, employment sponsored, you want to go ahead and pursue your national interest waiver, your EB1A. What you really have to be careful of if you're on a J1, F1, TN, any of those visa types that require non-immigrant intent, is that you be able to explain when you're coming through the airport or when you're going to the consulate, how you, despite the fact that you've applied for a green card, that you intend to return to your home country upon the completion of your studies, upon completion of your J1 research program, your employment on TN, your H1B1, or even your O1. And some of those categories have more of a softer intent than a harder intent. So it's really important that you just seek Immigration Council to find out what are the limitations for you in pursuing a green card if you're in those different visa categories. But you can apply for a green card at any time. You just have to be careful.
Okay, and along the lines of seeking additional immigration advice, there's multiple questions here about who to contact if people are looking for an assessment or a consultation from us, or the costs.
So you can, I think you guys will have access to the slide deck, I think, or the recording. But I can put in the chat my email address, but you can simply send me an email and we will, provide a complimentary assessment. And then from there, we will quote our fees, right? So typically we'll talk to UC students for about 10 minutes or provide a 10-minute assessment. And then from there, we'll quote our fees and let you know what our fees would be. And our fees vary based on the situation. And if you want a more in-depth consultation, then we will quote you what our consultation fees are.
Okay, does my financial background or credit score matter when applying for H1B?
For H1B, no.
Okay.
There's no relevancy to your credit score, your financial score. It used to be an issue before when they had the public charge requirements, but that's all gone out the window for H1B or for green card, because they used to ask a lot of questions about whether you are seeking public benefit or you're going to be a public charge, but that's all out the window now.
Okay, in your experience, if you have an employer willing to sponsor and you meet the requirements, what are the chances of getting an H1B approved if it is subject to the lottery, so not cap exempt?
Yeah, so it's kind of similar to what I said before. If you just do the math, if there are 85,000 slots and there are, I'm doing the math right now, 300,000 applicants, then there's a 28% chance that you'll be picked, maybe a little bit higher if you have a US master's degree. But it's pretty much like that every year, and we're seeing the same things, I think, within our firm. I think our firm's rate was a little higher, but it's pretty similar that's the rate, the percentage of being selected. I always say I like to be optimistic, so I always say less than 40% chance. But I guess I should start saying less than 30% chance you'll be picked.
What do you think about if you have a US master's degree? How much does that increase your chances?
Maybe 5%. I don't know. It's hard to say, right? We don't know. They didn't give us the breakdown of how many of the 65% or 65,000 picked actually were US master's degree holders. So we know for sure 20,000 were at least US master's degree holders, but we don't know how many picked in that 65,000 pool were actually US master's degree holders. But like I said, it increases your chances if you have a US master's degree.
Is it possible to get an H1B visa or green card on the passport of a country that is different from the passport of the country in which the F1 visa exists?
It depends. I've had this happen before. You actually need to look at the country and see if you can hold two passports, because I've had one client where that wasn't the rule and they actually had to go to the consulate that they had their new passport issued for and get a new visa stamp in that passport. So it depends. Have you seen it differently, Nate?
Well, I'm not sure if they're getting at cross-chargeability if you're applying for a green card and you've got multiple different nationalities. It's your country of birth. If you have a spouse that's from another country, you can use another spouse's country of birth.
I think they're asking, like, if you have a F1 visa stamp in your British passport, and then you get a new citizenship with another country. If they don't recognize dual nationality, then I think you have to get a new visa stamp in that other passport that you just became.
Oh, I see.
a
If
citizen of.
you're adding another nationality, that's right.
Yeah,
You have to
because
have.
you lose the nationality from your other country. So you have to really look at the rules of the country that you're gaining your new nationality or citizenship from.
Okay, about H1B portability, transferring H1B to a new employer. How does the process differ from applying for a new H1B? Do we need to pay the filing fee again?
So you have to remember the big difference between if you already held an H1B number and didn't use up your entire 6 years, is you don't have to go into the lottery again. So you don't have to worry about the 65,000, 25,000 H1B numbers. You hold that number. And so when you change employers, you hold that number. So that's number one. Secondly, in terms of fees, the fees are the same. The only time the fees are decreased is if you are extending your H1B with your current employer, and it's the second extension. So that's usually the situation where the fees would be about $1,500 or $750 less. But typically, if you're changing employers, the fees are the same.
Okay. Someone asking, can you elaborate more on the employer sponsoring a green card, which is point 10 of the H1B myths? Point 10 of the H1B myths says you have to work for a certain time period on H1B before green card sponsorship.
Yeah, so a lot of people think you have to be on an H1 for a certain number of years before you could be sponsored. That's not true. It depends on the employer's policy, right? We have some employers where as long as you pass the 90-day probation, they'll actually start green card sponsorship for you. So like I said before, these questions that are asked about how soon should I, when can I, it really is dependent upon your employer and their policies. So it's not typically restricted on immigration, but really restricted on what is your employer's policy on green card sponsorship, H1B sponsorship, all of that.
Okay. After selection for H1B in April, do all people get H1B in October?
Depends, because if they don't adjudicate or process the case until after October 1, then your H1B won't be effective until the date that they actually approve it. So last year, we actually had one case that still hadn't been approved by this year. So even though we filed it during the window you could file, by February of 2021, because it got a request for evidence and because we didn't premium process, we were still sitting here waiting for the H1 to get approved. So once the H got approved, it wasn't approved until February of 2021. So the H1 didn't kick in until February of 2021. So no,
Okay.
It doesn't always mean you get a 10/1/01 start date.
That's right. And I mean, it doesn't mean you get approved for H1B either. You still have to file the petition and meet the standard.
Yeah, registration means nothing. It just means that you got a number, right? Whether you're going to get your H1 approved is dependent upon all the documentation submitted by your employer to prove that you qualify for the H1.
How good are your chances of getting an H1B approved if it is cap exempt?
If it's cap exempt, usually if you're working for a university and the position normally requires a degree and you have a relevant degree, it typically gets approved. The only time we've seen pushback, I would assume, is when it's one of those marginal occupations or your degree is not related. But I have not seen those types of cases been denied in my career. But I'm sure there's some, but I haven't seen any. We're almost at time, Wes. It's almost 10:30. Is there anything else you'd like me to address before we wrap up?
No, I think you've covered all the questions people have asked. Just to confirm one thing to make sure I understood right. So after looking at your slide on the national interest waiver, if a person thinks that, they probably might qualify, they can send you their CV and you'll do just kind of an initial assessment.
Yeah, usually, yeah. So what we do is we send you like a 5-page questionnaire. We tell you to fill it out and tell us all your accolades. And then Nate and I usually will look at it and we'll tell you, we feel like you have a good shot. We feel like you need more X, Y, and Z. And then from there, if the UC Davis student or scholar wants to schedule a more in-depth consultation, then we'll quote a fee and then we'll move towards an in-depth consultation. Yeah.
Okay.
But we have many UC Davis students and scholars who ask us for advice, and
Great.
we're more than happy to provide that preliminary assessment. And
Great,
I put
great.
my email address in the chat, so everyone should have it now.
Yeah, and again, we've worked with your firm for a long time and have a really good relationship. So I'm glad that our students are taking advantage of that.
Yeah, but thank you for listening to me and thank you for the invitation. I hope to see all of you in person when you guys all go back live.